You know, I was watching the TV the other day, watching the Discovery Channel, and I saw a story about solar flares. And I found it to be very, very interesting because what this news program was talking about was, in essence, the idea that mankind may be overdue for a very severe solar flare, the likes that the age of technology that we have today has never seen. And I wanted to bring on my good friend and author of the book When Disaster Strikes, Matthew Stein, onto the program because he recently wrote about this in his article called 400 Chernobyls. And you may remember him. We've had him on the program before whenever he came on to promote his book, When Technology Fails, a manual for self-reliance, sustainability, and surviving the long emergency. Matt, it's a wonderful pleasure to have you back on Follow the Money Weekly Radio.
Oh, Jerry, it's always a pleasure being on your show, and thanks a lot for having me back on.
Absolutely. You know, I want to talk about your book. Let's do that first. I want to just make a few comments because I think there's some things in here that our audience would really benefit from, but I want to then move quickly into your article because that's really what caught my eye. Although the book is excellent and it's filled with great information, especially for those who need to get prepared if they're not already. I was reading through this and thumbing through it, and I was noticing many things that I was not familiar with. So even those who are probably more advanced or think themselves more advanced, they could certainly learn from this book. But the idea of the solar flares and how that could impact our world as we know it, I think is probably where I want to go in this interview. So let's talk about your book first. I'm looking through this book now, and I'm really impressed because you have broken this book down into 3 parts. Tell us about the book. What's the purpose of the book? Why did you write it?
Well, the purpose of the book is to provide just everybody, the average Joe, average family, who just wants to do the right thing for themselves and their family in a crisis. It tells you what you need to know, do, and have on hand to keep your family safe in times of emergency and crisis. That's what it is in a nutshell. And it's divided into 3 parts. So the first part is general preparation. So that includes short-term preparations, food supply and storage, backup energy, heat and power for your home. A lot of people always ask me about generators, and I'm a mechanical engineer, and you kind of assume everybody knows how to hook these things up and what to do, but that's not the case. So I've got a really good section on backup heat and power and lighting for your home for those times when the grid's down for, a few days, a week, whatever. I mean, it could be down for a long term, and we'll talk about that later, what might bring the grid down for a very long term. So then the second section is skills and tools. So that includes first aid, staying healthy in a crisis or pandemic, emergency survival, water, purification and storage, communications, and there's a chapter on self-defense and personal protection. And then the last section is specific disasters and crisis. It's preparations and strategies, and that includes fires, earthquakes, hurricanes and floods, tornadoes, winter storms, how to handle the cold without power and without heat. And then there's a chapter on electromagnetic pulses and solar storms, solar flares, solar storms, same thing. And the last chapter is the unthinkable, surviving a nuclear disaster. And, emergency preparedness is like car insurance. Nobody buys car insurance and plans on getting in a wreck. You hope and pray to God you never need it, but you have that insurance and it gives you that peace of mind that you're covered just in case. And emergency prep is like that too. Everybody in a disaster, you see those pictures of people walking down the street, they're cold, they're hungry, they're wet, maybe they're hurt, they're thirsty, and in all cases, those people thought that disasters was something that was going to happen somewhere else to some other person at some other time. And so do the smart thing, do the right thing for your family, get yourself ready to handle whatever may come down the pipeline.
Matt, we use something called 5 levels to financial freedom. It's something we developed here. In the very first level, we teach people the importance of having a go bag. And I would say the majority of people get that idea. They understand the importance of having a 72-hour survival kit in your car, one in your home, in the event that you just have to get out of Dodge. I mean, I live in Houston. Hurricanes can happen here, and the whole town kind of shuts down, and, it can be really difficult. And so having a bag that you have everything in that you could live out of for 3 days just makes sense. But I would say that some people just don't buy into that fact. And I would say those people are probably those who have never really suffered through anything or really experienced anything that you're talking about in this book. What do you say to those people out there who say that, this is kind of quacky, or, why do people focus on this kind of idea? Do you really believe all the things you're writing in here?
I believe that with what's going on in our world now, we're seeing crazy weather. We're seeing earthquakes in places that aren't used to seeing earthquakes. We're seeing increased tensions with places like Iran. We've seen nonstop wars where we're bombing the hell out of people in different countries. We make a lot of enemies. You go in and some drone wipes out your wedding party and your niece and your children and your wife. You're going to feel like wreaking some havoc and damage, and when your life is ruined like that, or someone you love dearly is gone. So I think to just ignore the signs of our world is just being a fool. It's like being an ostrich with your head in the ground. And if you don't get any preparations together, well, then you suffer the consequences if that day comes when you wished you could purify water out of that ditch rather than having to drink it. I once ran out of water. I was climbing El Capitan in 1984. It was Memorial Day weekend. Turned out record-breaking heat, 100-degree plus heat in south-facing walls. We brought the standard amount of water, ran out. We could have finished the last drop of water we had with breakfast and still been thirsty on our third day, and we had to do the whole day in 100-degree plus heat. And it was miserable. And I tell you, when you're that thirsty, you'll drink anything. The most green, scummy, smelly, disgusting water, you'll drink it, because if that's all you've got, you won't be able to stop yourself from drinking it. And having something in your go bag so you can purify that water and drink it for yourself and your family, that's just common sense.
You do allude in the book a way that you can actually disinfect ditch water. You can pull water out of a ditch and actually disinfect it. Let's give away a freebie here from the book.
Okay.
How can you actually...
Well, one of the ways... say you don't have any of those cool gadgets on hand. You can go dumpster diving and pull out spring water bottles, just those clear plastic poly bottles, fill them up with water, lay them sideways, preferably on a black surface so they get really hot, and the UV rays from the sun will kill all the bugs in that water in 6 hours' time. If it's a cloudy day, it'll take 2 days. If it's raining, well, collect rainwater, because the UV rays won't make it through the rain, but you can still collect rainwater. Now, so that's one way. Or you can pull out, maybe you got a bottle of Clorox bleach. Now, it shouldn't be bleach with scent. It shouldn't be, something, just plain old Clorox bleach. And you put about 5 or 6 drops in a quart of water. Downside is if the water is warm, you got to wait about a half hour. If it's a little cool, you got to wait about an hour. If it's cold, you got to wait 2 hours. If it's freezing cold, you got to wait 4 hours for it to kill the bugs in there. And there are certain bugs that it won't kill, called cryptosporidium, which is a really nasty bug. Made 500,000 people sick in Milwaukee when it survived the chlorination in the system and got into the public water and killed about 112 people back in the mid-'90s. So, Clorox bleach is great. For the most part, you'll be fine, but, you may still have some cryptosporidium that could make you real sick, even with the bleach. But there's plenty of ways, or you buy a $50, $70 backcountry filter and you pump the water in there, and cryptosporidium will get filtered out and the bacteria get filtered out, and you get good tasting water, and it's safe, and you can pump it and you'll be drinking it in 30 seconds and not have to wait half hour, 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, depending on the temperature of the water.
We actually bought from Amazon.com was Katadyn pocket microfilter. It's a little stout. I mean, it's like $250, but
it's a great filter. Katadyn is excellent. The two brands I personally use and recommend is MSR and Katadyn. And some people say Katadyn, because it's metal housing, it's really well worth the money. You can get an MSR that'll be just as effective, but it's a plastic housing for like $90, $70. So it depends on your budget. MSR one is what I tend to carry and use. I bought a Katadyn for my wife's go bag for her car. So, they're both excellent.
Interesting. Well, one of the other things in the book that I liked, and I think this would really help a lot of people out there, is the idea of having an emergency preparedness plan for your family. And what kind of things should that cover? For those out there who are listening, maybe they have some kids at home, obviously their wife, they're listening to this program, what can they actually do to prepare for the inevitable?
Well, one of the things you do, you discuss with your family plans, and you say, okay, if we're separated, cell phones are down. Cell phones are kind of like the first thing to fail in a big disaster. People think that they're bulletproof, but they're not. 4 hours after the power is gone, most cell phone relay towers will run out of backup battery power, and your cell phones will be dead. So you think about a place locally where if you're separated, you can meet. Like, okay, say we can't get home, we can't meet at home, let's meet at the football field at the local elementary school or someplace. And then you also pick an out-of-town contact. Often in a disaster, for some reason, you can get calls out of the area, but you can't get calls anywhere within the area. So you say, let's talk to Mary Sue in Kansas City, and we'll all phone her whenever we can to let her know where we are and that we're okay and how to coordinate and meet each other. And I actually have a friend who went through that, where his wife was in the Bay Area during the Loma Prieta quake, and they couldn't get calls across town, but she was able to call up to the Reno Tahoe area to let him know that she was okay. She could call out of area about 3 days before she could call across town. So that's something to think about. And also with your family, try to show each member of your family how to shut off the gas and the water and the electricity for the home, because in many crises you don't want to have your gas on. If there's an earthquake or if there's a fire running by, you turn off the gas supply and turn off the electricity, turn off the water. In some cases, in a earthquake, many parts of the country don't have to worry about the water supply. But if each member of the family knows that, that's quite helpful. So those are all. I have a whole bunch of tips at whentechfails.com, my website, and you can click on articles and get all the details for about 30 different items for your grow bag and your family emergency plan, different items you need to have, and that's totally free. And then, of course, in my book, When Disaster Strikes, it's all laid out, and it walks you through the planning stages and what you need to say and what you need to do and what you need to have on hand to keep your family safe in times of trouble.
That's really good. Well, another topic here that I want to bring up is the idea of disease and contagion. I've been overseas at least twice now where there have been things going on. Contagion, I remember the swine flu and the bird flu. These things turned out to not really be a big deal. But, it seems like we're flirting with an eventual disaster of some sort because of the antibiotics that we're using over and over again. There's just a general fear, I think, and it's probably very well informed, that we're just kind of maybe just a period of time away from whenever we suffer a pretty major blow when it comes to disease control. Number one, do you believe that? And number two, what are some things that people can do to take care of themselves just in case?
Well, number one, I totally believe it, and we actually have a real problem right now today. And it's not pandemic, but there's MRSA, there's Pseudomonas aeruginosa, there's a whole variety of super antibiotic-resistant bugs. You could come home from a minor procedure with the hospital and lose an arm or a leg or your life because you picked something up in the hospital that drugs don't respond to. And you could also, and there's things like extreme drug-resistant tuberculosis. Remember a few years ago, that guy that they chased all over, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, chased him all over. He was on vacation or honeymoon in Paris, somewhere in Europe with his wife, and he had this extreme drug-resistant version of tuberculosis. They ended up getting him off a plane in Canada and flying a CDC jet up with guys in bunny suits to pick him up and take him to a center for treatment. They were so worried about it getting out in America. So these bugs are there today, and there's always the potential for pandemic from one of these bugs. They recently artificially took bird flu, which is over 50% fatal in humans, but it's generally very difficult for humans to get sick with it. And they artificially in the lab mixed genes between bird flu and a regular flu, and they got a virulent form, easily transmitted form of super deadly bird flu. And the government said, wait a minute, don't publish these results because some terrorist organization might read your results and figure out how to do it themselves and unleash this on the world. So this is a very real issue. And this is where it's critical that you have some different items in your bag of tricks. And that's why I have like a top 10 list of items to have in my chapter on staying healthy in a crisis or pandemic. And very important. So top of my list probably is colloidal silver generators, the ability to make colloidal silver anytime you want. Turns out that tiny charged silver particles are toxic to all known bacteria and all known pathogenic bacteria. It's kind of magical. They say, oh, well, it doesn't hurt the good bacteria in your gut and it hurts the bad stuff. And you say, yeah, and I believe in Santa Claus too. But actually, the same thick cellular wall that protects probiotic bacteria in your gut, the good stuff in your gut, also protects them from the silvers. So there is truth to that the silver kills the bad bacteria, not the good bacteria. But That's number one item. There's another item called MMS, Miracle Mineral Supplements or Solutions, depending on how you want to call that. There's some controversy over that, but it's proven in Africa to kick malaria in 3 days for just a few pennies. For like 50 cents, you can heal malaria in 3 days. And there's people who claim they've healed tons of things of it, but it doesn't work on everything, and nothing works on everything. And there's other items to have, like tea tree oil that penetrates through the skin to zap infections and to zap funguses, and Spilanthes usnea. Usnea is a broadband antibiotic. So I have a whole list of things, and again, that's in the book and on the website at whentechfails.com. And this is a really serious issue, and having a bag of tricks to rely on in the event that some super antibiotic resistant bug is going around or hit you or a family member, or there's a pandemic, or there's just simply been a huge disaster and the hospitals are overloaded, you can't get your hands on antibiotics and your family's sick and you need to do something. Having those things on hand to treat yourself and your family could make the difference between life and death.
Matt, I think everybody should have a survival guide of some sort on their bookshelf along with, the other books that they have. And I've had different ones on my shelf. Of course, I have the U.S. Army Survival Guide, which is a great one, and I've had different ones. The book that you put out, the When Technology Fails, I've actually read through that thing entirely. And that one sits on my shelf now. I think, I was amazed that you were able to put that book together because it was so detailed and so dense. And I'm looking at this new book you've put together, and very similar. I mean, you're writing some very detailed information here in these books with lots of charts and graphs and images. So it's very simple for people to understand. So I do appreciate that. I want to re-mention the fact that your book is titled When Disaster Strikes. That's your latest book, and that's available right there on our website at ftmdaily.com if they'd like to learn more. Or you can go to Matt's website at whentechfails.com. All right, I want to move into the article that you had recently written about EMPs, solar flares. I was watching this thing on Discovery Channel, and it was telling me about these different solar storms that had occurred throughout history. There was one back in the 1850s. There was one in the 1920s. And it was really making the point that this could become a very real issue sometime in the not-too-distant future. And you wrote an article on this very specific topic that was actually published. Talk about the reality of a solar storm that could lead to disastrous consequences for us.
This is a huge, real problem. And the good news of it is that for the price of a single stealth bomber, a couple $2 billion, the worst effects of a solar storm or a terrorist electromagnetic pulse, both of them cause similar effects over different parts of the world. The worst effects of both of those could be mitigated for basically a couple $2 billion. But here's the story. Back in 1921, when the last extreme solar flare hit our planet, it lit up the sky for a couple of days just incredibly at nighttime. It was like orange and golds and greens and purple streaks and just amazing light show all night long, all the way as far south as Haiti and Dominican Republic and Hawaii, and as far north as Samoa. So it basically, you had northern lights covering almost the entire planet, north and southern hemisphere, except for a tiny sliver of the tropical zone that avoided it. What these did then was not a big deal. It was the day before the grid. There was telegraph stations. There was individual electrified cities. It burned down a couple power plants, Penn Central Station. It burned down a few telegraph stations. But, life went on. It was no big deal. That was the days before nuclear power plants, before the massive electrical grid, and before microelectronics. Well, it turns out that these solar storms induce huge currents. We have over 100,000 miles of high-voltage power lines in the United States, and those act as a giant antenna web to capture the electromagnetic energy from this solar storm. And when they do that, they send thousands of volts and thousands of amps down these lines, and what happens is those volts and amps hit these huge transformers that our grid's totally dependent upon. They're called extra high voltage transformers. They're like 350 kilovolt volts in these transformers, and when they do that, they screw up the oscillations in the transformers, they lose efficiency, and they burn up. And you say, well, so what? You burn up a few transformers, and you go buy a spare part, you put a spare part in, and everything's good, right? Wrong. Problem is that each of these EHV transformers They're 300 tons each. They're custom made and built for every single individual installation. It used to be a 1-year waiting list. Now there's a 3-year waiting list because China and India have been expanding their grids so rapidly. They've been sucking up the world's capacity. And they stopped building these in America back in the 90s when they finished our grid upgrading to these extra high voltage transformers. So they didn't even have a factory to make them in this country. And worldwide, they can make a little over 100 of these a year. Well, it turns out the government got really concerned about the potential damage in the grid from both electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear terrorist or from solar flares. So they did some modeling and scientific studies, and they found that 350 of these big transformers would get cooked in the United States alone, roughly 2,000 in the world. So if we had a storm like 1921, it would take 20 years of production when the world's working well to make all the transformers to replace the ones that got fried. Well, you say, how real is this? Well, back in 2003, they had a much smaller storm, like 1/10 the size, less than a tenth as strong as the 1921 storm. It kind of focused on South Africa, and it burned up something like 14 of their transformers. It screwed up their grid for well over a year, caused rolling blackouts all over. Imagine trying to do work when your shopping center is down for like 6 or 8 hours during the day, no refrigeration, no phones, no lights, no cash registers, nothing. Pretty tough to work like that. And that was when only 14 of these things got cooked. Now imagine 350 getting cooked in North America. Now, to make matters worse, it turns out that our nuclear power plants are 100% dependent upon a stable grid to maintain cooling for the power plants. So they're designed with backup batteries to kick in to keep cooling going when the grid has a major anomaly or it's a grid down blackout situation. So the backup batteries last about 4 hours, and then they got generators. Those generators they have about a week's worth of fuel on hand. But what happened in Fukushima, the earthquake didn't directly cause the reactors to fail. What they did was they took the grid down, and the reactor's backup generators kicked in and kept the cooling going. But then the tsunami came along and wiped out the generators, and a couple hours later they start going snap, crackle, pop. They start getting hydrogen explosions. They start blowing their containment vessels, and, it was really a nasty problem, and it's going to take them decades to clean up the radioactive contamination. Now, in a solar storm, imagine all of a sudden we've got 104 nuclear reactors in the United States, 40-something nuclear installations. Some of these installations have 3 or 4 reactors, some have 1. Now imagine that a week after you see this incredible light show at night, there's been no grid, the grid's down, and the grid's down for long term because they didn't protect the grid from these solar storms. Now all of a sudden a week later, reactors are running out of fuel all over, and they start going off. And all of a sudden we have 30, 40, 50, 60, 80, 100 nuclear reactors blowing their tops, just like Fukushima, all over this country. So not only do we have no grid, stock market collapse, no water flowing, nothing, now we also have nuclear reactors blowing their tops. And to think that we could solve this problem for the price of a single B-2 bomber, that's just outrageous.
Yeah, it shows you that we have our priorities out of whack. All right, but you claim that the chances of us having one of these super solar storms similar to those back in 1921 are 100%.
Oh, yeah. It's just a question of time. They've looked at ice core samplings. They estimate roughly every 75 to 100 years on the average they hit our country. Last one was 90 years ago. The one before that was 62 years before that. Average between those two is 75 years. So you could say we're either 10 years, 15 years overdue, or we're due somewhere within the next 10 years. But basically, statistically wise, we're due somewhere in our near future for another one of these. It's just a crap shot. It's like you just don't know when one's going to happen, but they're guaranteed. They happen throughout history. It's just that because the last one happened before modern microelectronics, before the modern grid, before nuclear power plants, we're grossly unprepared for it happening in our modern-day electronic world. And so it will happen. It's just nobody knows when. Now, for 50 years plus, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers warned that New Orleans was a disaster waiting to happen, that the levees were totally inadequate, and they needed to be rebuilt, and that it wasn't a question of if New Orleans when a major hurricane hit. It was a question of when the next major hurricane would hit, and it was a guaranteed that New Orleans would flood. Well, for 50 years, they ignored that warning, and they put off rebuilding the levees, and we lost a good part of New Orleans. It'll never be the same, in our lifetime at least. Now, similarly, we have scientists who studied this issue and say this is going to happen. This is no question, and we have solutions to fix this. Right now, today, they've come close to passing the resolution, and it's called the SHIELD Act in Congress, to implement at least some of the safeguards for our grid so we don't have total grid down situation for months to years after the next solar storm hits. But so far they have ignored the issue and they haven't passed the legislation to do this. And so one of the reasons I'm talking about this and writing this article is that hopefully we'll get a groundswell of people waking up and saying, you know, this is a bigger issue than people think. It's not a pretend issue, and this is real, and we need to do something about it. So that's one of the reasons I'm on the air today, is telling people, hey, wake yourself up, Google my 400 Chernobyls article, or go to my website, whentechfails.com, and call your congressman. I've got links there for getting a hold of your local congressman and to learn more about the issue.
Very interesting. Okay, so some people would say, well, you know, if it's really that big of a deal or if it's really that certain, well, then surely Washington would have done something about it by now. But, I mean, you and I both know that that's absurd because there's a lot of issues that Washington could solve with, the stroke of a pen, but they just don't seem to understand that it's incumbent upon them to do so. So how much time, based upon your knowledge of this, how much time would we have if, best case scenario, how much time we have to prepare for this? We would see it coming, I assume.
Well, you'd see it coming when you go outside at night and say, wow, incredible light show. I've never seen or heard of anything like this. The sky's lit up orange and green and red and gold streaks, and you'd just be blown away with that light show at night. And then the grid fries. And in a week later, there's still no grid. Then at that point in time, you have to assume that nuclear power plants are probably going to be going snap, crackle, pop. And that 1/3 of America lives within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant, 1/3 of the American population.
Wow.
So having my book on hand allows you to at least understand what's going on and say, okay, this is the situation, and this is what we have to do, and this is how much time we have. And it allows you to make good decisions at a time when people are panicking and don't know what to do because they have no clue. At least if you got my book, you got a clue. You got a strategy written out there, and you can predict what's going on. Now, if the grid comes back on and everything's rosy, then great. So if you bugged out of town and you realize you better get out of the downwind zone from a nuclear power plant and you drove at nighttime to avoid massive traffic jams and stuff like that, and everything turned out to be fine, then, well, okay, you had a little exercise in getting out of town, and nothing much was lost. Maybe you missed a couple days of work, and you're back, and everything's great, and that's wonderful. But if it's actually the case where our government didn't spend that $2 billion and you're in a serious issue, having my book on hand and doing the right thing will mean the difference between life and death for you and your family. And I hope that situation never happens. I'm not.
What a sales pitch!
I'm not hoping it.
What a sales pitch, Matt! If you have this book, you're going to be okay. I mean, that's really. I mean, the information that's in this book is going to talk about how to respond to something like this, isn't it? I mean, it really does.
Right. It gives you the strategies, and it also tells you what to look for, so you can figure out actually what's happened. I mean, the average American will have no clue, and they'll be like, wow, how come my internet's not coming up and there's no water coming out of the tap and the grid's been down and it's just still going down and there's been no storms and, what's the story? I mean, again, my book is about lots of less scary scenarios than this. This happens to be the scariest scenario, and at least there's strategies in there for you to do the best you can for you and your family, and to be able to recognize actually what's happened, because in a grid-down situation where there's no TV, no radio, no internet, it can be very hard to actually figure out what's really going on.
Well, these extreme solar storms, I mean, assumedly they've been going on, throughout all of recorded history, but we've just never been in a position where I guess before they used to just be nice light shows for the for the folks without electricity. But now, I mean, with all of our dependency upon the electrical grid and everything, you're saying, these can really be problematic. So we're in a very different kind of generation now. There's also the threat of EMPs. What are you more concerned about? Are you more concerned about an imminent solar storm or a terrorist setting off a EMP?
Well, both of them are bad scenarios, but I'm more concerned about the solar storm, because the solar storm affects most of the industrial world. I mean, we've had roughly 100 significant solar storms in the last 150 years. Only 2 of them were in the really extreme category where they caused these effects we're talking about. But we had 2 in the last 25 years that caused millions of dollars worth of damage to the grid and caused short-term power failures in certain areas. And certainly the one that caused, long-term rolling blackouts throughout an entire country of South Africa for over a year's time because of the damage. So they're significant, but they do happen on a regular basis, and the really big ones don't happen very often, and we're due for a really big one. So that's got me more concerned, because in the case of an EMP, well, the rest of the world is still okay, and even a good portion of the United States will still be okay. So at least there's places for the cavalry to come from to help out for those areas that are crippled by an EMP. The downside to the EMP is that it actually causes more damage locally. It's just not nearly as widespread. So in an EMP, what it'll do is it won't cook every electronic device in America like Newt Gingrich says it will do. I mean, he obviously hasn't read the report, or he'd know that what he's saying is just plain wrong. But it will cause grid collapse over a smaller area than a solar storm. And the bigger danger is that it causes failure in EMP tests where the scientists simulate an EMP. It causes failure in the digital electronic control systems that keep our factories and our power plants, including nuclear power plants and chemical refineries and communication systems and water processing. All of our industrial processes are controlled by these digital electronic control systems, and they're extremely vulnerable not to solar storms, but to EMP. The grid is vulnerable to both solar storm and EMP, but these electronic control systems are very vulnerable to EMP, which means that you'll have most of the industrial processes will be totally messed up for a long time and very difficult to diagnose and fix and repair, because in our modern day, everything's diagnosed electronically, and when those electronic diagnostic digital systems are also cooked by an EMP, it'll be really, really hard for people to figure out manually what's wrong and how to repair it. So you're talking a huge problem over a large area, but nothing like the size of a solar storm, which would basically cook most of the countries of the world's industrial areas except for the tropical zones, like part of Mexico and India and Malaysia and Singapore. Those tropical industrial centers will probably be relatively okay in a major solar storm, whereas most of the rest of the world will be in a panic, total chaotic grid down situation long term, unless they implement the devices to protect the grid from it, which they haven't done yet, but they're talking about it.
Well, and the global elitists, they got to be shaking in their boots, because, currently the docile American public, they let the TSA stick their hands down their pants. They let them put them through the naked body scanners. They are willing to let them hold them, without any kind of due process, hold them indefinitely thanks to the new National Defense Authorization Act. But I tell you what, Matt, you turn off their Kardashian TV show, or you cut off the Facebook. This docile American people who have been sleeping, I would imagine, will rise up to the occasion and say, look, we want our internet back. So maybe in some ways that might be a good thing, where, because people will then rise up and say, hey, as of right now, they're stripping us of so many rights and taking away so many of our liberties. Maybe we do need the power shut off to wake the folks up.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping that we get a real wake-up call, and that we get solar storm more like what hit South Africa hits the United States and causes some pretty major damage and chaos, but not a total everything down situation. And that would be the best, really, because then it would be like, oh, wow, we've really got to protect ourselves, because this was bad and it could be 10 times worse than this or 100 times worse than this. That's what I'm hoping actually happens, is we get, a minor jolt before we get the big shebang. Because if we get the whole shebang, you're talking mass starvation, you're talking what is a city of 9 million people? Where do they go to the bathroom when there's no sewage pumping? Where do they get their water when there's no water? They got to go to the local duck ponds and rivers and creeks to get their water, and everyone will be going to the bathroom everywhere. I mean, you're talking all of a sudden third world America, but third world like Haiti after the earthquake, that kind of third world, and not a pretty sight. And the thought that this is totally avoidable, I mean, there's no way we can protect all of our electronics from an EMP, but we can protect our grid from collapse due to an EMP and from collapse due to a solar storm, and we can protect our nuclear power plants with EMP-hardened silos that have spare generators and backup parts and mandate that there's a year's worth of fuel kept on hand at every single nuclear reactor in the country, so that if some of these parts get cooked by the solar storm and the EMP, that they've got spare parts in a shielded container, then they can install them right away and get them going. It's kind of no-brainer stuff. It's like car insurance for your car, only we're not talking about a head-on collision. We're talking about a end of the world as we know it situation, and preventable. Everything bad from happening, but we can prevent the worst stuff from happening.
The voice you've been listening to is Matt Stein. He is an MIT-trained engineer. He's a best-selling author. The book is When Disaster Strikes, a comprehensive guide for emergency planning and crisis survival. I was impressed, Matt, to see that you got James Wesley Riles to write the foreword to the book. Of course, he's the guy who runs survivalblog.com. He's a great guy. Very, very nice to see him write the foreword because I know he has a very big audience, and I'm glad to see that he's recommending your book. And before we let you go, I got one more question. There's an interesting thing in your book, the rule of threes. I think this is really nice, kind of a takeaway to folks. The rule of threes, briefly describe, you have 5 of these things. What are they?
Okay. Well, the rule of threes kind of gives you an idea of where your priorities need to be in a crisis situation. So here it is. 3 seconds without blood flow to your brain, and you're out. So that's blood circulation in your body. 3 seconds without circulation, and you pass out. 3 minutes without an oxygen supply or being able to breathe, and you pass out, and you're out. 3 days without water, if it's hot and you have to be physically active, and people start dying in 3 days. Now, obviously, it varies, because if you're in the Sonoran Desert and you're out in the middle of the desert with no water in the middle of the day, you could be dead before the day's over. 3 weeks without food. Most Americans, they wouldn't like it, they wouldn't feel good, but most Americans can live 3 weeks or more without food. So it gives you an idea of your level of priority. It's circulation of blood, number 1, airway, breathing, access to oxygen, number 2. Those are kind of no-brainers. Number 3, water, and last on the list is food. So that gives you an idea of where your priorities need to lie.
All right, fantastic. Well, Matt, how can the folks learn more about you and your work? What can they do?
Well, go to my website at whentechfails.com, WHENTECHFAILS.com, and click on articles, and there's lots of great, totally free information. It will give you a taste of what's in my books, both When Disaster Strikes and the larger, bulkier, more comprehensive When Technology Fails. So there's new stuff in When Disaster Strikes, like EMPs and solar storms and surviving a nuclear catastrophe. None of that stuff was in the old book and When Technology Fails. And so if you want to get a good place to start, the new book is shorter and easier to dive into, and it's very well organized to help you get your act together to do the right thing, to have the right stuff on hand and the right knowledge for you and your family for that day that you hope never comes when a disaster strikes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt, for coming on the program. I'm sure we'll have you back on soon.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure, Jerry, and have a wonderful day.